my sophomore year of college, which was 1993, I believe, maybe 1994. I lived in an apartment with 3 other guys, and one Friday evening, my 3 roommates and I went into the city of Chicago for the evening. None of us owned a vehicle, so I borrowed my sister's 1977 Toyota Corolla, affectionately named Ebenezer. Ebenezer was blue, part of it was blue. The rest was rust and maybe a little white. The most consistent thing about Ebenezer was the noise that Ebenezer generated, and had no suspension left to speak of. We called it, sometimes we would refer to it as a Flintstone vehicle because you could see the roadway passing by through some holes in the floorboards. On our way into Chicago, I'm driving, and we're approaching a light that was green, and then the light turned yellow. Now, I know that we come from different schools of thought as to the appropriate reaction when a light turns yellow. I come from the accelerate school of thought. So I did. I actually floored Ebenezer. 3 things happened. The noise increased. Actually, no, that's not true. 2 things happened. The noise increased, the vibration increased, the speed did not. There was no change, and it was terrifying. By the time I understood what was happening, it was also at that point too late to brake for the light. In fact, an oncoming car, you pull out into the intersection if you're going to turn left, the light changes yellow, and then you turn. They turned right in front of us. There was a lot of honking of horn, and I swerved around and kept going. It was so bad that my friends in the car did not even realize that I had accelerated. So from their perspective, I just kept, calmly going forward at a consistent speed into this intersection with oncoming traffic. As we consider the next passage in our series about God's plan through the eyes and story of Joseph, I want us to think about expectations. See, I had the expectation that when I stepped on the accelerator in my sister's car, that acceleration would actually occur, that there would be a cause and effect relationship between the two. When my expectations were not met, though, obviously, I was in trouble. Often, I think, when we consider the path of our lives, our future, God's plans for us, we form expectations, and those expectations are based on faulty assumptions. So as I've already mentioned in previous weeks, we can hold the expectation that God's plan puts me at the center, and therefore His greatest goal is my happiness and my comfort. And if that is our expectation, then the reality of life is going to shock me. If you don't have a hard copy Bible with you this morning and you would like to borrow one so you can follow along in the scriptures that we'll be looking at this morning, the ushers are coming back down the aisles now with some copies, and if you raise your hand, they'll be glad to give you one. If you don't own a hard copy Bible, please don't just borrow this one. Raise your hand, take it, accept it as a gift from us. Make it your own, read it. Today, from Genesis chapter 39, I want to draw out 3 more aspects of God's plan. Now, the intervening chapter, which is chapter 38, right? So for 2 weeks, we were in chapter 37. Now we're skipping to chapter 39. Chapter 38 does not address the Joseph narrative at all. Now, there are theological reasons for which the author inserts this sort of parallel account into the story, but I'm not going to deal with those or with that chapter in this series, but just know that's why we're skipping 38, because it doesn't forward the Joseph narrative, but that there are good reasons for its placement. So I'll be reading Genesis chapter 39, and for those of you unfamiliar with the Bible as a book, Genesis is the first book of the Bible, and it sets the stage for everything else that follows. So if you start at the beginning of the Bible, turn a few pages, you're going to see Genesis at the top of the page. Keep going until you get to chapter 39. Remember the context. The last we've heard about Joseph is that he was sold by his brothers to these Midianite, Ishmaelite traders and then they in turn took him to Egypt and sold him to a man named Potiphar, who was one of Pharaoh's officials, and Pharaoh is the king of all of Egypt. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he's entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day, he went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard my scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. Then she told him this story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. First of all, God's plan feels more like a Kansas interstate. Let's try that again. God's plan feels less like a Kansas interstate and more like a roller coaster. I chose Kansas here because it has a reputation of being very flat and boring, and also gives me the opportunity to razz Pastor Gabriel and Pastor Roger a little bit, both of whom are from Kansas. But is it not true that our expectation is that once we belong to Jesus, and if we're in good standing with him, like if we're being good little boys and girls, then his plan will be smooth, flat, fast, straight, with a destination that makes sense, right? With a destination that's clear to us. What do you imagine Joseph would say to us about that expectation? We've already spent time in chapter 37. Joseph is a good kid, right? Maybe a little naive, a little arrogant perhaps, but a good guy, good son. His brothers hate him, consider murdering him, throw him into a pit, sell him to slave traders, then deceive their father into thinking that his favorite son is dead. Okay, that's bad. It shouldn't get any worse than that, right? And following Joseph's arrival in Egypt, things do start to look up a little bit, right? His life's getting back on track after a pretty significant detour, but he's in a wealthy household. He's in a position of responsibility, authority, and favor. So God's plan is back in motion, right? It's back on track. Have any of you ridden the roller coaster at Cedar Point called Maverick? Anybody? Just don't leave me hanging here. Let me see. Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm not alone. So the first time and only time that I rode it, I wasn't quite prepared for the fact that when you feel like you're done, all of a sudden, you know, you've gone through all these loops and everything, and then it slows down and comes almost to a stop. And then there's this incredible thrust of speed that shoots you off again into the second half of the ride. Just when I thought it was coming to an end, it all starts over again. Now, Joseph experiences something similar, but this action is another downhill. It's just direct downhill. So things are starting to look up, things are getting better, there's been a little bit more stability in his life, he has favor with his new master, and then discouraging descent. Because from favored son to favored slave is already a long drop, right? But from favored slave to a dungeon is even farther. Now I remind you that God has revealed the end goal for his people, corporately and individually. God is building a people, a family, a church, to be in relationship with him, and through us to show his glory to the universe. Individually, God is making each of his children more and more like his son, Jesus. But even though we may vaguely understand those destinations, the road to get there often seems torturous. It's not a straight line. We're definitely not in Kansas anymore. And if our expectation is a Kansas interstate and our reality turns out to be the roller coaster Maverick, we'll be tempted to abandon God, or at the very least to doubt that he's still in control. So continuing with this roller coaster metaphor and analogy, near where we lived in Texas, there was a little, sort of a very small amusement park. It was in a place called Kemah, and there was a roller coaster there called Silver Bullet. And it was all one of those wood roller coaster that was very rattly and very jerky and everything else. And I remember the first few times that I rode that roller coaster, I came out sore. Like legitimately sore. My neck was sore, my shoulders were sore, my hips were sore, everything was sore. And eventually, I don't know if it was our third or fourth visit to this place, I realized what was causing the soreness is that I was actually resisting the movement of the roller coaster. So I would see a turn coming, and because I knew it was going to be jerky and abrupt, I would actually sort of move my body in the opposite direction in my mind, like I was going to counterbalance what was going on. And so when that hard turn would come, it would throw my body even more violently the opposite direction because I was resisting it. So I decided, okay, I'm going to try something. This next time, I'm just going to lean into everything. So when the turn's coming, instead of going the opposite direction and bracing myself, I'm just going to relax and lean into it. Believe it or not, it was a marked different experience. Far more enjoyable, far less painful, and I never would have guessed that simply surrendering to the prescribed movement, right? Because I'm not going to change the course of that roller coaster by moving in the opposite direction. I can resist it all I want, but I'm still going to go where that car takes me. If we surrender to God's plan, even when we do not understand the directions in which he is taking us, but if we surrender to him rather than resisting him, and we rest in the confidence of his sovereignty, his goodness, and his control, then he will move freely through us. The twists, the turns, the hills, the drops of life, they don't mean that God has forgotten or that he's absent. They're part of his plan. And he will carry that plan out in us for his glory and our good, as we just sang a few minutes ago. So don't lose heart, don't give up, but the invitation is, say yes to God's plan. And I realized that saying yes to his plan means saying yes to the unknown. And that's one reason we resist it so much. Secondly, God's plan unfolds with him. What brackets this chapter, the beginning and the end? It's God's presence with Joseph. So verse 2 says the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 21 says the Lord was with him. And the final verse, again, affirms God's presence with Joseph. Now, aren't those encouraging statements? Now, what we also see in each of these conditions is that it's God who gives Joseph success. God is the one who makes him successful. So we've kind of had this repeated theme over the last couple weeks of the reality that God does not require success of us. What he requires of us is faithfulness. And this particular chapter illustrates that success is God's responsibility. That's in his hands. So whether we are successful or not isn't our responsibility. That's his. Our responsibility is faithfulness. Joseph is faithful, but God is the one who gives him success. God is the one who gives him favor in the eyes of Potiphar, also ultimately in the eyes of the prison warden. God gives him success. And yet, here's the irony. The only way that we can be faithful is if God is with us. So in this passage, we see God with Joseph. And it is through God's presence that Joseph is capable of being faithful. And then God gives us success. John 15:5, very well-known verse. I know a number of you would be familiar with it. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, I'm the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do a lot. Okay, good. I see at least a few heads that are shaking. That's encouraging to me. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Could it be, even as we imagine ourselves being faithful to God, we picture that faithfulness being our effort apart from him, as though our faithfulness and our efforts toward faithfulness are a means of gaining his approval, of coming to him, right? If I work really hard, if I'm really faithful, if I'm obedient, then I'll get closer and closer to him, and finally I'll achieve that welcome and relationship with him. It's not. Apart from him, we can do nothing. Apart from him, we're incapable of faithfulness. God illustrates this so clearly in Joseph's life. His plan, God's plan, is to be with his people. In fact, the only way his plan can succeed if he is present to and with us. If his plan is to make us more like Jesus, then the only way to do that is for us to be with Jesus. When we would travel back to Texas during our years living in Brazil, we would go back to Texas in each summer. And Julie would always make fun of me, and she would accuse me of putting on a faux Texas accent when we were back in Texas, especially with a particular demographic of people. And I did not think I was doing that intentionally. Maybe I was, but I do know that when I was with Texans, that accent would start coming out just a little bit in my speech. But it was because I was around them. It was because I was with them. So there's no way that we can become more and more like Jesus unless we are with Jesus. Or better way to put it, unless he is with us. That's the only way. So we need a shift in our thinking that our faithfulness is not what earns us the right to be with Jesus. It is his being with us that enables us to be faithful. And we're not done with God's presence yet. Because what we also see illustrated in this chapter is that God's presence does not equal an easy life. That might be our expectation. Where does the text tell us that God was with Joseph. In this chapter, he was with Joseph in slavery, and he was with Joseph in prison. When life is hard, when suffering overwhelms us, when the sorrow is just too deep or the pain is too poignant, it's so easy for us to cry out, right? To ask, God, where are you? We assume that the harder things are, the further away from us God is. Now, it feels that way. I acknowledge that. I'm not denying that. We often feel distant from God in sorrow and grief. But God is not far. Hardship and pain do not mean that he is distant. He is near, he is with. He leads us into and through pain for his glory and his purpose and his plan. Theologian Terence Fretheim says this: divine presence does not mean a preventive medicine or a quick fix of whatever may befall a person of faith. Nothing can replace the blessing of God's presence with his people. And his presence is not passive, it's active. He's not just standing there next to Joseph, like in a corner, just watching. God's presence equals God's action. And it's God's action that causes Joseph to prosper, to do really well, that gives him favor in the eyes of those in authority over him. And just because we suffer does not mean that God is either distant nor inactive. Thirdly and finally this morning, God's plan is to bless others through the faithfulness of his people. Verse 5, the author of Genesis writes, "The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph." That's really important to catch that. So it's not just the child of God or the people of God that are receiving the blessing, but the blessing is flowing through Joseph to pagans, to the pagan household of Potiphar. It's also interesting to note that Potiphar recognizes that the Lord was with Joseph. And remember, in the NIV, when the word Lord is all capitalized, that's the name of God, Yahweh or Jehovah, as we might say it in English. It's not the generic term for God. So Pharaoh somehow has become aware of Yahweh, the name of God, the one and only true God. So there's perhaps we could read between the lines to say that Joseph might have also been a bit of an evangelist. I don't know. But how else would Potiphar have come to know the name of God? It says that Potiphar recognized that Yahweh, Jehovah, was with Joseph. And then when Joseph ends up in prison, we see the exact same result. God's presence with Joseph enables his faithfulness, which results in blessing to the warden and ultimately to the entire prison. And for those of you who know how Joseph's story ends, and we're going to see this over the coming weeks, even greater blessing is coming for a vastly greater number of people through Joseph in the coming chapters. Do you remember last week I mentioned that we must avoid the trap of thinking, what I do doesn't matter because God's going to work everything out for good anyway. Right? It doesn't really matter if I'm trying to be faithful. It doesn't really matter if I am avoiding sin or fleeing temptation. None of that ultimately matters. Why? Because God is sovereign and God's going to turn everything and make his plan come out right anyway. He is able to work all things together for good to those who are called according to his purpose and those who love him. And this part of Joseph's story illustrates the foolishness of that perspective. Terence Fretheim again. What God's people say and do makes a difference regarding the welfare of others. So on the one hand, that's a remarkable responsibility. On the other hand, that's an incredible privilege. That the choices that we make toward God, the surrender that we give to His plan and to His character and to His will, can be a vehicle of blessing for others around us. So the point is, our faithfulness really does matter. It doesn't just matter for me and my relationship with God. It matters for me and the world. The opposite is likewise true, right? Our acts of unfaithfulness also carry influence to those around us. Now, you're probably used to this mantra now. Just as God's presence does not mean an easy life, faithfulness on our part does not mean an easy life. Because Joseph's faithfulness is admirable, isn't it? He's consistently, over and over, propositioned by Potiphar's wife. And the text intimates that Potiphar is not only oblivious to anything in his household, but he doesn't even care. There's only one thing that Potiphar cares about. Did you notice what that was? His food. I can kind of understand Potiphar a little bit. Not really. The only thing that he concerns about, he's obsessed with his food. He doesn't care about his wife. There's even an implication there that he's probably ignoring that part of the marriage relationship. He doesn't care about his household. He doesn't worry about anything because Joseph's got it. And it does seem like the immediate risk to Joseph of giving into this temptation would probably have been minimal, while the pleasure, potentially, of giving in could have been significant. But the author of Genesis goes out of his way to point out how Joseph is exceedingly careful to do everything that he can do to run away from that temptation. The text says not only does he not listen to her and refuses to go to bed with her, but it says he refuses to even be near her. So he recognizes that temptation. He does everything he can do to be away from it. If we look over to some New Testament evidence, and I always want to point out the coherence between Old and New Testaments. 1 Corinthians 6:18, the Apostle Paul writes to the people of God, and he says, flee sexual immorality. Flee means run away from hard and fast as you can. It doesn't mean stroll. It doesn't mean saunter. It doesn't mean kind of look back longingly. It says flee, get away from. Ephesians 5:3, Paul again writes to God's people, but among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality. That's the standard, not even a hint. So there's consistency in Scripture, right? Joseph's actions of fleeing these temptations were acts of faithfulness to God, right? They were. He was being faithful. And finally, we see him so desperate to avoid temptation that when Potiphar's wife grabs his coat and they're alone in the house, it wasn't intentional, no other servants were around. Joseph, from the text, we can infer that it was at a time when other servants should have been about. They were not there. She grabs his coat. He slips it off. He's just keep my coat. I don't care. I'm running out of the house. I'm not going to let you hold me back. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that once again, we see Joseph's garment, right, his coat or his robe, used against him in a deceitful way. So his brothers have already used the ornate robe or the coat of many colors to deceive their dad into thinking that Joseph is dead. And now we see Potiphar's wife using his coat to deceive her husband into thinking that Joseph had made a pass at her. Now, what we all want to happen, and what we would probably expect to happen if we were in Joseph's place, was for things to now go really well for us because we had pleased God and been faithful to Him, and we were wearing our halos. I mean, that is kind of what we expect, isn't it? I've been a good boy. Now reward me. But the opposite happens. In fact, it was Joseph's faithfulness at this point that led directly to this woman's bitter revenge. But, sisters and brothers, remember, it's not Potiphar's wife who is ultimately responsible for where Joseph ends up. From a human perspective, that's what we see, right? Oh yeah, her lies, her deception have taken Joseph to prison. God is working. His plan is moving forward. And while to Joseph, prison may have seemed further away from favor, from success in God's plan, even further than slavery was, we're going to discover that prison is only a dream interpretation away from the throne of all Egypt. Now, that's not the way that we would have understood that from a human perspective. Because what we see happening, what we perceive happening, is that God, the direction of God's plan, and our expectations are diametrically opposed. So they're getting further and further apart. As Joseph goes into prison, he's further and further from success. He's further and further from the completion, the resolution, the fruition of God's plan. But prison actually gets him that much closer. Faithfulness to God does not guarantee an easy life. It does not guarantee our comfort. It most certainly does not keep us from suffering or pain. And we need to guard ourselves from that false expectation that, Lord, if I am faithful to you, everything will turn up roses. Ultimately, at the end of all things, and for eternity, that is true. And this is again why we desperately need those lenses of trust and faithfulness, right? To trust the Lord. Trust His plan because we do know the final destination. And faithfulness, though it does not necessarily lead to an easy life, it does keep us near God. It keeps us in step with His plan and has the potential to bless others around us. So, in closing, the first question I would ask to all of us is, have we, or have you, have I been resisting or fearing God's plan? Maybe you've learned from experience that your expectations aren't right, and so the thought of the unknown plan of God is just terrifying. So the invitation this morning is to say to God, yes, Lord, I submit and I surrender to your plan. I don't know what it is. I know the final destination, to be like Jesus and to be with Him forever. I know the final destination of all of us together here, to be your family, to be your church, and to be with you forever. I know all that, but the intervening path is really scary to me. Lord, have mercy on me. And may your presence with me give me the confidence to say yes to your plan. So will you surrender to His plan rather than trying to hold Him to your expectations? And instead, together we trust Him to guard us, to carry us, and to make us faithful. Another invitation is to acknowledge and celebrate God's presence, right? His withness. He is with you. And that withness is not dependent upon you feeling like He's there. We all want to feel His presence. And we do. He gives us that gift from time to time. But our feelings don't determine His proximity or distance. He is with his people. And then the next invitation, one that we've asked the last couple of weeks, but what's the next step of faithfulness to which God is calling you and which he is empowering in you? What's that next step? Because that could look very different for each one in here. I don't know your specific context or situation. What's the next step that the Holy Spirit is putting on your heart and calling you to? If you step into that faithfulness, there's that potential that God uses that to bless others, and that's an incredible privilege. And finally, I just want to close with this, the coat thing again. Remember, we talked about this last week. What's your robe? So Joseph's robes keep getting stripped off of him and used against him. What is that false identity that you've taken upon yourself that, at least in some way, in your perspective, exalts you? Or maybe it protects you. Maybe it's a false identity that you can hold up in front of others so that they don't see who you truly are. And I remind you that if you belong to Jesus, if you have come to him in repentance and faith and given your life to him, then your identity is a daughter or son of the Most High God. And you don't need any other mask, you don't need any other defense, you don't need any other shield, any other way to project yourself to the world than him. Over the past few weeks, I've been preparing you for a change in how we conduct altar prayer at the end of the service. Today, we implement that change. So what is that going to look like? Off to the side, where you see these high-top tables, or maybe you can't see them because of where you're seated, just by faith, trust that they're there. We will have some prayer ministers who are trained that are over there by those tall dividers. And as you have a need or desire for prayer, and sisters and brothers, listen, this can be for anything. It does not have to be a direct response to this sermon. It's whatever the Lord's doing in your life. Maybe it's a care that you already came with this morning. And maybe it's not something new. Maybe it's something you've been carrying for a long time. But regardless, you are invited as we continue to sing and worship to go to one of those prayer ministers. And they will share your need, and they will pray over you and pray for you. And this is something I'm aiming for and desiring for and hoping for. Let's say there's people at every one of those ministers. What should you do? Well, you have the choice of sitting where you are and waiting, but it might be that someone else beats you to it. So don't be afraid and don't be ashamed to just we can form lines over here on either side and just wait. And as the next minister becomes available, you can step up to them. If you're waiting for a specific person, and then let people behind you move forward. We're going to figure this out, right? Might be a few weeks of some bumps and rattles here, but we're stepping into a culture change and into a practice of us lifting up one another to the Lord in prayer and helping to carry each other's burdens like this to the throne of God. Meanwhile, all of the altar is open. And if you want to come and worship, kneel, pray, respond on your own at the altar, you are always welcome to that. Would you stand with me, sisters and brothers, as we continue to worship the King of Kings, Lord of Lords?